Hello and welcome to my screencast on ethics and research. This is designed for EPQ students in sixth form, but it would apply to other people as well. It's a very thorny issue and one that most students need to think about very carefully. And now to set the tone and as a kind of starter, I'd like to show you a short video.
Let me show you a monkey raised on a nursing wire mother. Now here are 106's two mothers. As you can see, it was weaned on a wire mother. Here's baby 106. Watch.
He's going to the wire mother.
He's got to eat to live.
Oh, he's going back.
He's back on the cloth mother, and he'll stay on the cloth mother. Actually, this baby spends from 17 to 18 hours a day on the cloth mother and less than 1 hour a day on the wire mother. We had predicted that the variable of contact comfort would be a variable of measurable importance, but we were unprepared to find that it completely overwhelmed and overshadowed all other variables, including those of nursing.
Frankly, Doctor, if it comes to a choice between wire and cloth, it's reasonable to expect that any child will go to the cloth. It's a matter of creature comfort, like a baby with its blanket. But is this really love?
Well, what do you mean by saying that a baby loves its mother? Certainly one thing we mean is that it gets a great feeling of security in the presence of the mother. Now, Mr. Collingwood, wouldn't you say that if you frightened a baby, that it went running to its mother, was comforted, and then all the fear disappeared and was replaced by a complete sense of security that that baby loved its mother? Now, in this experiment, this is the apparatus we use.
That looks diabolical.
That's just the way the baby monkey feels about it. Flashing eyes, loud sound, moving mechanical parts, all of these things are designed to frighten a monkey. Now here we have a peaceful, resting baby monkey. Let's find out what his reactions to his mother are when we frighten him.
He's scared, all right.
And he does what any child will do in a similar situation.
He runs away.
It's more than running away. He was running to his mother, to touch her, to drive away his fear. Contact with the mother changes his entire personality. Look, now he's actually threatening the diabolical object. All right. This gives us...
Now, for those of you who don't know the experiment, it's a very famous experiment by Dr. Harlow into studying dependence in monkeys, and in particular looking at ideas of motherhood and the relationship between children and mothers. Now, immediately you may ask yourself, was this experiment acceptable? It raises all kinds of important questions, doesn't it, about the distress to the baby monkey. And I think we find ourselves in changing times now where an experiment like that wouldn't be so widely publicized. No doubt they still continue, but animal rights have become such an issue now. And likewise, ethics in general have become a huge issue in research. And for those of us who've conducted research, we know that violating ethics can actually have you thrown off your degree. It can have your research more or less deleted or withdrawn, and you can lose your position as a researcher. So the kind of things that we're going to be discussing today are really important. And although EPQ students aren't going to do experiments on animals, etc., you will be doing some research which will be using human subjects. And so this screencast will look at some of the important issues surrounding research of that nature. So what will we cover today? We're going to look at the background to research ethics. We're going to be looking at the value of consent, of saying yes, and transparency, knowing what the research is about. We're going to be looking at what a plain language statement is. We're going to be looking at the importance of debriefing your participants. We'll have a look at a student's personal plain language statement, forgive me. And we'll look at the role of deception. We'll look at a very famous experiment called the Milgram experiment that many of you may have heard of. And finally, I'll touch on plagiarism, but only quickly because I've done a separate screencast on this extremely important area. Now, there have been many unethical experiments in the past. Many of you may know that Nazi doctors, for instance, did experimentation to breaking and re-breaking people's bones. Obviously, they were treating people in their concentration camps in a dehumanized manner. But there have been other ones too. For instance, patients were injected with live cancer cells, and you can read about that in the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital, 1963. So fairly recently, really. There's the appalling experiment in Alabama where 400 men were left to suffer with syphilis long after a cure was found because they wanted to study the effects of syphilis. And very famously, there's Milgram's experiment, which we're going to look at in a moment, which looked at, it was a study into obedience and human behavior. And so what I'll do very quickly is I will show you a short video from the Khan Academy, thanks to them for this, that gives you a kind of overview of Milgram's obedience study. And even if you're familiar with it, I think it will be really important for you to watch it once again.
The Milgram studies were conducted in order to study the willingness of participants, average everyday Americans, to obey authority figures who instructed them to perform behaviors that conflicted with their personal beliefs and morals. And as you can probably imagine, it might be hard to recruit participants when that's what you're trying to study. And so in order to keep the participants from finding out what he was actually trying to look at, Milgram used deception. He started by posting ads looking for people to participate in a study about learning and memory. And I actually have an image of the original flyer here. And you can see that they really tried to make it a point to recruit average, everyday people. When they arrived at the lab, they were told that they were going to be participating in a study that was trying to look at the effects of punishment on learning. So, do people learn best after they've been punished for making a mistake? And there were 2 participants involved in the study, and they randomly decided, by picking out of a hat, who was going to play the role of teacher and who was going to play the role of the learner. In reality, one of the participants was actually a Confederate, meaning that they were working with the experimenter and were secretly in on the point of the study. And choosing the roles out of the hat wasn't actually random in this case, because it was rigged in such a way that the actual participant always got the teacher role and the Confederates always got the learner role. While the teacher was watching, the experimenter hooked the learner up to a number of electrodes. And they were both told that the teacher was going to teach the learner a number of word pairs, and that the learner would be shocked whenever they gave the wrong answer. In some versions of this study, the person playing the learner noted that they were worried about the experiment because they had a heart condition, so they were worried about the shocks. At which point the experimenter would explain to them not to worry, that the shocks would be painful but not dangerous. The teacher was then taken to a different room where they couldn't see the learner. They had no visual contact with them. And they were sat in front of a box of switches that they were told was a shock box. The first switch was labeled 15 volts, and the switches increased at 15-volt increments until it reached 450 volts. Along with an indication of voltage, there were also labels that went along with the switches. And I've written a number of them down here, but they went from slight shock to moderate shock to strong shock, and then things like very strong shock and intense shock and extremely intense shock. And then, kind of troublingly, a label that noted that the switches would give a severe shock and the warning of danger XXX. The teacher was instructed to read a long list of word pairs to the learner, and then when they were finished, to go back and read the first word of each pair, and then offer 4 possible pair words. of those 4 possible pair words. The learner would indicate what they thought the answer was by pressing a button, and this was displayed on a screen to the teacher. And whenever they made an error, the teacher was instructed to give them a shock at increasing increments. So the first wrong answer got a shock of 15 volts, the second one 30 volts, etc. And just so you're aware, even though the teacher thought that they were giving the learner shocks, no actual shocks were given. But of course, it was really important that the teacher really thought that the punishment was being administered. After giving a number of correct answers, the participants seemingly started giving incorrect ones. And of course, the pattern of correct and incorrect answers that the learner was given was determined by the experimenter well beforehand. And the first couple of shocks really didn't elicit that much of a reaction. The learner would kind of gasp when they happened, but nothing more than that. However, after several increasing shocks, the learner would start to pound on the wall and cry out in pain. And eventually, they would start to complain about their heart condition, saying things like, "Let me out, my heart is bothering me, let me out." And as the shocks increased, they would continue to yell and scream that they wanted to quit. And after this, after a certain point, all responses from the learner would cease, and there would only be silence from the other room. If at any point during the study the participant playing the role of the teacher wanted to check on the other participant or stop the experiment or even just looked back at the experimenter for guidance to see what they should do, they were told things like, "Please continue," and "The experiment requires that you continue," and even, "You have no other choice, you must go on." The experiment came to an end after either 4 verbal protests from the teacher from the participant, or after they had given the final shock of 450 volts to the silent learner 3 times. Before he started his experiment, Milgram had asked a number of professors and psychology students and clinical psychologists whether or not people would obey the commands of the experimenter. And they overwhelmingly said that people would not. That most of them would stop when the learner protested, and that very, very few people would shock all the way. And that those that did were probably psychopaths. And so when the results of this study came out, they were actually really disturbing, because 65% of participants shocked all the way. 65%. And to be clear, those participants didn't do so without feeling. They had protested, they were sweating, and they were trembling. But they still obeyed the commands of the experimenter and shocked to 450 volts. And in the versions of the experiment where the learner claimed to have a heart condition, and specifically claimed that the shocks were hurting their heart, full compliance did drop, but not by much. It dropped to 63%. And again, these were everyday average Americans who heard the cries of people they were tormenting and continued with the task. And I want to end with a quote from Milgram, and it's kind of a long quote, and I've written it out here, but I think that it's really important and really sums up the results of the study. He wrote, "I set up a simple experiment at Yale to test how much pain an ordinary citizen would inflict on another person simply because he was ordered to by an experimental scientist. Stark authority was pitted against the subject's strongest moral imperatives against hurting others, and, with the subject's ears ringing with the screams of the victims, authority won more often than not. The extreme willingness of adults to go to almost any length on the command of an authority constitutes the chief finding of this study and the fact most urgently demanding explanation. Ordinary people, simply doing their jobs and without any particular hostility on their part, can become agents in a terrible destructive process. Moreover, even when the destructive effects of their work became patently clear, and they were asked to carry out actions incompatible with fundamental standards of morality, relatively few people have the resources needed to resist."
So I think you can see why the Milgram experiment was so famous. It came out with this very dark conclusion that we're all obedient to authority, and in the wake of the Nazis there was a general sense of depression that people would conform and do terrible things in the right circumstances. I think the key thing of why we're looking at this particular video, though, is the idea is it acceptable to deceive your participants? And that's something that we're going to be looking at really carefully now. I could tell you that it's very unlikely that Milgram will get ethical clearance today for this experiment. people would see this as causing unnecessary pain. And Milgram's argument that it would be of benefit to people and that research could be used might seem like quite a thin one. Now, in terms of ethical codes, we need to think about patient autonomy, and we're using the term patient here like participant. Non-maleficence, which is really important, the idea that we're not trying to hurt people. Justice, beneficence, and veracity. So these are the codes of ethics that are used in medical work in particular, but they are also used very often within research in general. Now, if we look back, there have been some very key moments in terms of research when people have decided that they need to codify the way that research happens. Now, following the Nuremberg trials, when the Nazis were convicted for war crimes, the Nuremberg Code set out guidelines for ethical treatment of human participants in 1949. And then this was followed by the Belmont Report in 1979. And the most important conclusions of this is that individuals should consent to participate in studies. And we shouldn't use people who are unable to consent, such as prisoners, children, and people who perhaps had some kind of mental deficiencies. The second thing was the researcher must not harm the participants. They need to minimize the risk for them. And the third idea was fairness in procedures for selecting participants. So that's also become very important, how you select the people in your research. The APA guidelines from the United States were also important. They reinforced many of the Belmont report's procedures. They insisted that we protect patients from physical, psychological harm, that we should avoid anxiety and anything that lowers self-esteem, and that the general concept of informed consent, that's the key term, informed consent, was really absolutely crucial. Now, there is the term clinical equipoise, which is an interesting one. There are times when we're looking at two different treatments, as you can see in the diagram here, treatment A and treatment B, that we can actually compare the rate of cure to find out which one is better. Now, in this case, we're allowed to do it when there is honest professional disagreement amongst experts comparing which treatment is best. Okay. Now, one of the most important things in research, as I've said earlier, perhaps the most important thing, is the idea of transparency and informed consent. So we need to explain why and ensure that our participants understand what is required of them, what the study is for, and how it will be used in the future. And this is where the plain language statement comes in. So the plain language statement, as its name suggests, is an easy, non-technical, short, concise document that explains to your participants exactly what the researcher is trying to do and what their role in this research will be. So it includes a little description of the purpose, the methods, the demands, are they going to have to travel, what are they going to do, etc. And it gives a few ideas about how the project is going to work, and it details the risk and potential benefits of the research. And one of the most important things will be identity and the protection thereof, because it's become very standard today to make your participants anonymous, and that's something that we'll go into in a little bit more detail. Now, if you are in Dubai English Speaking College, you'll be able to look at the example of one of the students here, and it shows you a voluntary participation form, and it shows you what we call a consent form. So in terms of your research, you'd be expected, if you do any kind of interviews, not necessarily short questionnaires or surveys, but interviews, to produce signed consent forms where people have said, yes, I understand exactly what the research is and I agree to it. So that would be standard. And that's something that would then appear in your EPQ appendices, okay? Now, if you are in the English speaking college, here is an example of a plain language statement. It was written by one of our students. She was studying Jehovah's Witnesses and whether we could describe this organization as a cult or not. And it gives information to its participants. So this is standard practice and good practice in the EPQ whenever you have a human research element, okay? So will you need to write a plain language statement, okay? This is something that you can discuss with your class, with your group, and with your supervisor. You need to decide whether you're actually interviewing people, whether you are going to use the words of people, etc. And if you are going to write the plain language statement, you need to just think of these questions. What will you need to explain? What are the dangers to participants? And how will you protect your participants from harm? We spoke in particular of the importance of pseudonyms, giving people fake names, or being anonymous, that being one. Now, earlier we saw in the Milgram experiment deception. And there can, in some very rare circumstances, be a role for deception, whether it's passive deception, not withholding some information, or actively misinforming your participants. But for the purposes of the EPQ, and you've seen how Milgram did this, this would never be allowed. This is something which is extremely rare today, and you would have to show an ethics committee that there was a real reason for you to do this, and the research would have huge benefits to humankind. So it's something that I don't think we need to touch upon too much. This idea of justified deception is something that Milgram would have used. I don't think that, as I said earlier, the Milgram experiment would pass today's ethics committees. Now, debriefing, which I mentioned earlier, is really important. So when you speak to your participants, you have to tell them what their findings were, and you have to give them the opportunity of changing the findings or withdrawing parts of the findings. This is a very important part of the APA ethical guidelines, and it's something that most universities use today. Very importantly, you'll have to show how they will be anonymous in this publication and all future publications that might follow. Now, for the purpose of the EPQ, this is not so important, but imagine you go on to do a PhD one day and you're going to use the research in many different conference papers, etc. You'll have to make sure that you are able to protect the identity of those people. Now, in terms of reporting of research, this also has ethical considerations for you to think about. You're not allowed to fabricate data. This is something we'd expect on the EPQ as well. If you interview people, make sure that you give us their true words. You don't edit or modify or put in little additions, etc. here. If you discover there's significant errors in the data, you should take steps to correct them. And finally, C, you do not present other people's work as your own. This is something that will feed into the idea of plagiarism. In terms of the academic world, the major safeguard is peer review. And as many of you will know from the critical evaluation session that I recorded, critical review, peer review is when an expert peer or a group of expert peers check your work and seek to replicate it. They check your sources for accuracy, etc. Now, in terms of the EPQ, I, as the coordinator, often sample some of your references and I look into some of your research in order to give you a high grade. So in a sense, I become that kind of peer. Now, there are a number of EPQs here that I would like you to judge. So I'm going to stop the recording and I'm going to ask you to decide whether you think these projects are too ethically harmful for you as the coordinator to allow, or whether there's some of them that might have some benefit. Now, they're quite difficult to judge, and I'm not going to go through all of them because I think they would be a bit tedious, so I'll just highlight a couple. If we look at the first one, a study in teenage eating disorders using my peers, I think that we would agree that that would be an absolutely disastrous EPQ to allow. These are extremely vulnerable people, people who need to be treated with sensitivity. And I don't believe that somebody at sixth form level, even the brightest and most sensitive of people, would be in a position to do that. And that would place people in harm's way, wouldn't it? This was actually a genuine one given to me in the past, a study of my neighbor's son who suffers from autism. Once again, I do feel that it's a very dodgy one to take on board. I think someone who suffers from autism is very vulnerable, and any kind of missteps could really have disastrous consequences there. So once again, I think that would be another one where we simply couldn't allow that to happen. This is a much more unclear one, a grey one. A study into the religious beliefs of my peers. I think given our context in the UAE, I would immediately say no. If anyone's watching this from, say, the United States or, the UK, I'd say yes, with lots of reservations and with a very careful supervisor and coordinator watching exactly how this was done and making sure that there were safeguards so as not to cause offence, having lots of informed consent, and maybe checking with the subjects that their parents were in agreement as well. I'm sure many coordinators would disagree with me and simply not allow that one, but it's one that I might consider if it was very, very carefully safeguarded. And then the effects of moving on students in an international school. Bit of a little error there for me. I'll correct it on screen. Interesting one. Again, we'd need to debate that. There are some students in international schools who've suffered tremendous distress through moving and may actually be away from a parent or away from friends. They may be very unhappy in the present. So again, that would be one that you'd have to be very careful about. At the same time, I do think that that could have benefits for students. And then finally, a study into how many students have been hit by their parents. No, because there's a legal issue there, almost in every country, I don't think that that would be research that we could approve for an EPQ. That doesn't mean I don't think that research shouldn't be undertaken, because I think that research potentially could have great benefits for young people who are being beaten and abused. However, it is not the right kind of topic for an EPQ. Now, just very briefly, I'm just going to mention plagiarism, because it is a very important one. As I said before, I've already recorded a screencasting of this, so I'm just going to say that in research and in writing, it is absolutely key that you credit people with ideas. Students sometimes make the mistake of thinking that research is all about creativity. Of course it's not. In many cases, it's assimilating other people's work, and there's no harm borrowing ideas. In fact, you might argue that research is borrowing lots of ideas and putting them together in a new way. The key thing is to acknowledge your sources, especially in the field of research. And in order to acknowledge these influences, you need to watch the screencast on how to reference. Remember that referencing is absolutely key to acknowledging where you got your ideas from. So just to finish off then, we've looked at the background to research. We looked at animal ethics just to set the tone, but didn't really go into that because we don't believe that that's something that will affect many EPQ students any at all. We looked at the value of consent and of transparency and what the plain language statement is and how you should have consent forms if you're interviewing people or getting data off them. We've looked at the role of deception in Milgram and whether that could be acceptable in certain circumstances, and we decided for the purposes of the EPQ, deception wouldn't be allowed. And then finally we ended by plagiarism and talking about the importance of acknowledging other people's ideas. And I just will end by talking about the fact that if you do human research and you do use consent forms or a plain language statement, it's absolutely essential that you refer to this in your production log and that you place it within the appendices of your essay. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that this was an informative screencast, and I hope to see you back on my channel.